It didn't arrive like a normal Netflix release. No countdown, no press tour, no warning. One moment, the platform looked the same as it always does. And the next, there it was, a quiet edition, a new chapter. And according to 50 Cent, the part that was never meant for the public to see this early. Today isn't just another update in the Diddy story. Today feels different, heavier, because this doesn't play like a sequel. It plays like a correction, like someone stepping back into the frame and saying, you didn't understand what you were watching the first time. Back in December, when The Reckoning first dropped, the industry reacted fast. Statements were issued. Lawyers spoke carefully. Some people went silent altogether. Viewers thought they had seen the full picture. 4 episodes, clean structure, a beginning, a middle, and an ending that felt like closure. But closure was an illusion, because from the very start, there were gaps, scenes that cut away too early, names mentioned without explanation, moments that felt unfinished, like the camera was deliberately turned off right before the important part. And while the public debated what was real and what wasn't, one voice kept repeating the same thing quietly in the background. This isn't everything. Now, with this new release, that statement finally makes sense. Because this chapter doesn't explain Diddy's rise, it doesn't recap the allegations, it doesn't slow down to educate casual viewers. It assumes you were paying attention the first time. And that assumption changes the entire experience. This time, the documentary doesn't ask who Diddy was. It asks how certain things were allowed to exist for so long without ever being fully addressed. And more importantly, who else was always in the room? That's why this part feels aimed less at the audience and more at the industry itself. At people who understand what certain footage means without needing narration, at people who recognize the weight of certain silences, at people who know that what's not being said can be louder than any accusation. And that's also why Jay-Z's name doesn't appear with fireworks or headlines. It appears through proximity, through timing, through moments that don't scream for attention but refuse to disappear once you notice them. Before we go deeper, pause for 1 second and answer this in the comments. Do you think this new chapter is exposing new information or reframing things that were hidden in plain sight the whole time? And if you want every breakdown as this story continues, subscribe now, because this isn't slowing down, it's tightening. What makes this release unsettling isn't that it claims to reveal brand new secrets. It doesn't. Instead, it rearranges familiar pieces until they start telling a different story. Conversations that once felt harmless now feel calculated. Absences feel intentional. And moments that were treated as isolated suddenly sit side by side in ways they never did before. The timing is critical. This chapter doesn't drop during a quiet period. It arrives while legal appeals remain unresolved, while civil cases move quietly in the background, while the industry once loud, once reactive, has largely chosen silence. And silence in this context isn't neutral. Silence is pressure management. This documentary understands something most commentary misses. Power isn't challenged by noise. It's challenged by context, by letting viewers see patterns without telling them what conclusion to reach, by slowing down instead of escalating, by trusting that memory will do more damage than outrage ever could. There's no dramatic narrator telling you what to think, no flashing labels spelling out accusations. Instead, the camera lingers. Conversations end early. Footage cuts away right when your brain starts asking questions. And that restraint is deliberate. Restraint signals confidence. It says, we don't need to convince you. We just need to show you enough. This chapter avoids the moments everyone has already seen. No award shows, no red carpets, no overplayed interviews. It focuses on the in-between spaces, after parties, private rooms, planning stages, moments before cameras were supposed to stop rolling. The places where reputations are built quietly, not publicly. And once you notice that shift, the entire tone changes. The pacing tightens. Scenes don't resolve the way you expect. Instead of answers, you're left with alignment. Timelines that overlap too cleanly. People who appear around the same events more often than coincidence would suggest. Nothing is shouted. Everything is implied. That's where the tension lives, because implication forces memory to work. You start remembering interviews you've seen before. Statements that once sounded confident now feel selective. Silence that once felt dignified now feels strategic. Not false, not criminal, strategic. This chapter also leans heavily into repetition, not of clips, but of behavior. The same kinds of responses given years apart. The same phrasing used in different situations. The same reliance on reputation to carry conversations that were never finished. Repetition turns coincidence into pattern, and patterns are what investigations are built on. There's an emotional shift that's impossible to ignore. The earlier documentary felt like revelation. This one feels like consequence. Colder, slower, almost resigned. Like the shock phase is over and the reality phase has begun. And reality is far more dangerous to reputations than outrage. What's especially effective is how little explanation is offered. Long stretches pass without commentary, yet the meaning keeps building. You aren't told why something matters. You're shown enough to understand that it does. And once you see it, you can't unsee it. This isn't about convincing skeptics. It's about unsettling certainty. By this point, the viewer realizes something important. This isn't a story trying to go viral. It's a story trying to stay alive. It circles back instead of rushing forward. It revisits moments that were once footnotes and places them at the center, not to accuse, but to recontextualize. What once felt random now feels arranged. You begin noticing how often questions were acknowledged but never answered, how explanations were always deferred, how silence became the closing statement instead of clarity. And when those moments are stacked together, not years apart, but minutes apart, the tone shifts completely. This is where the discomfort settles in, because the documentary doesn't ask you to believe anything new. It asks you to reconsider what you already accepted. And once that process starts, silence stops working the way it used to. At this point, the story doesn't belong to the people on screen anymore. It belongs to memory, to comparison, to context. And that's when pressure begins, not loud pressure, but the kind that tightens slowly and doesn't release. And we're still only at the beginning, because in the next section, the focus narrows even further on how public narratives were managed versus what was handled privately, and why certain names keep appearing at the edges of moments they were never meant to be attached to. This chapter isn't about exposure, it's about alignment. And once alignment becomes visible, the rest of the story changes shape. The shift becomes impossible to ignore once you realize what this chapter is actually doing. It isn't trying to introduce new players, it's re-examining how familiar ones were positioned all along. And that's where the discomfort deepens, because the story stops being about one individual and starts becoming about a network of proximity. This is the point where names don't enter loudly. They hover. They appear at the edges of moments. Not centered, not highlighted, just present often enough that your brain starts noticing the repetition. And repetition, when it's quiet, is far more unsettling than accusation. This is how Jay-Z enters the frame. Not through allegations, not through narration, through timing. Through moments where paths overlap without explanation, through appearances that were once dismissed as normal industry movement, but now feel oddly consistent when viewed together. The documentary never says, "Look at this connection." It simply places scenes side by side and lets the audience sit with the alignment. That's intentional, because the fastest way to weaken a story is to overstate it. This chapter understands that implication, when earned, carries more weight than any headline ever could. You start to notice how often certain rooms appear familiar, how the same circles recur across different years, how people who claim distance still seem to move within the same orbit. Nothing illegal is claimed, nothing dramatic is announced, but the separation between public narratives and private proximity begins to feel thinner. This is where the documentary becomes less about events and more about structure. Structure matters because it reveals habit, and habit, over time, becomes strategy. What's especially effective here is how the film handles silence. Silence isn't treated as absence. It's treated as data. Each pause, each unanswered question, each moment where the story cuts away before resolution becomes part of the record. Not proof pattern. And patterns don't accuse, they suggest. This chapter leans heavily into that suggestion by slowing everything down. Scenes linger just long enough for discomfort to settle. Conversations end without closure. Footage stops before context arrives, and the audience is left doing the work the documentary refuses to do for them. That refusal is power, because once viewers begin connecting dots themselves, the conclusions feel earned. They don't feel planted, and earned conclusions don't fade easily. The tone here is colder than before, less emotional, almost procedural, as if the documentary has moved past the need to shock and entered the phase of quiet pressure, the phase where reputations aren't attacked, they're weighed, and weight is harder to escape. There's a moment in this chapter where you realize the story isn't moving forward at all. It's compressing time. Years of interviews, decades of public statements, old controversies that were once spaced far apart are now placed minutes from each other. And that compression removes the buffer time used to soften perception. Time has always been the safest ally of unresolved stories. This chapter strips that away. Statements that once felt confident now feel incomplete. Answers that were accepted at face value now sound carefully framed, not false framed, designed to say enough to pass, but not enough to conclude. This is where the documentary quietly introduces its most dangerous idea, that silence wasn't accidental. It was functional. Silence allowed distance. Distance allowed ambiguity. Ambiguity allowed comfort. And comfort allowed time to do the rest. But time isn't doing the work anymore. What makes this especially unsettling is how familiar the pattern feels once it's visible. A controversy surfaces. Attention spikes. A brief statement is made. Then nothing. Not denial. Not clarification. Just patience. Waiting for interest to drift. Waiting for memory to fragment. For years, that approach worked. This chapter exposes that not by attacking it, but by replaying it again and again and again. Each time in a different context until coincidence becomes difficult to defend. And this is where the audience's role changes. You're no longer watching to be informed. You're watching to verify. Each moment is measured against another. Each silence compared. Each decision not to engage becomes a data point rather than a footnote. The documentary trusts that viewers remember what was said months ago. Who spoke freely? Who stopped speaking? Who disappeared from the conversation entirely? And that trust creates a different relationship between the story and the audience. You're no longer being guided, you're being implicated. Once that happens, the story stops being entertainment. It becomes record. And records don't need new information to stay alive. They only need consistency. This is where the film begins to feel heavier rather than louder, because nothing explosive happens here. No shocking reveal, no dramatic accusation, just alignment, just continuity. Just the quiet realization that certain explanations never arrived, not because they couldn't, but because they didn't need to. That realization sticks. By now it's clear this isn't about proving wrongdoing. It's about exposing method, a way of managing attention, a way of letting narratives breathe just long enough to survive without ever being fully addressed. The documentary doesn't claim deception. It highlights separation. Public words on one side, private movement on the other. Two tracks running parallel without ever quite meeting, and separation, when sustained, becomes plausible deniability. This chapter forces the audience to sit inside that gap. You start noticing how often conversations pivot away from timelines, how accountability is acknowledged in theory, then redirected in practice, how clarity is postponed indefinitely, not denied postponed. Postponement is powerful because it looks responsible, it looks calm, it looks mature, but when it never ends, it becomes avoidance by another name, and avoidance, when repeated, becomes visible. That's the point where the documentary stops feeling like content and starts feeling like pressure. Not pressure from allegations, but pressure from continuity, from the realization that once moments are lined up, they don't scatter anymore. They hold shape, and shape implies design. At this stage, the story widens its lens. It's no longer asking what happened. It's asking why certain questions were allowed to remain unanswered for so long. Why complexity was used as a shield instead of clarity. Why silence was repeatedly framed as dignity. The unsettling part is how normal that strategy feels once it's pointed out. How often patience was mistaken for resolution. How often time was allowed to smooth edges that were never actually addressed. This chapter doesn't raise its voice. It doesn't need to. It lets proximity do the work. It lets sequence tell the story. It lets the audience feel the friction without being told where to look. And by the time this section ends, something irreversible has happened. The audience no longer waits for a reveal. They wait for a response, not a statement, not a denial, but engagement, something that acknowledges the full shape of what's now visible instead of fragments. Because fragments can be managed, but shape cannot. And that's where the tension deepens. Because once the room knows it's being watched, movement changes, silence changes, distance becomes noticeable, and reactions or lack of them begin to speak louder than anything ever said on camera. That's the shift happening here. By this stage, the story has quietly crossed a line it can't return from. Not because of any single clip or quote, but because the audience has been trained to see differently. Once perception shifts, everything that follows is filtered through that new lens. And that's where silence stops being neutral and starts becoming measurable. This chapter leans into that idea without ever naming it outright. It doesn't accuse silence of hiding guilt. It presents silence as a choice, a repeatable choice, a choice that appears at the same pressure points, in the same kinds of moments across different years. And when choices repeat under similar conditions, they stop feeling accidental. What becomes increasingly clear is that this isn't about reacting to controversy. It's about managing it, letting moments surface briefly, allowing them to generate just enough noise, then stepping back and trusting time to soften the edges. Time creates distance. Distance weakens urgency, and urgency is the real threat to control. The documentary shows how often attention was allowed to spike and then drift, how narratives were never shut down, just left incomplete. Incompleteness is powerful because it invites patience. Patience feels responsible, but patience, when extended indefinitely, turns into deflection without ever needing to deny anything. This is where the audience starts noticing something subtle but important. The responses don't evolve. The language doesn't deepen. The explanations don't expand. They stay broad, carefully framed, consistent in tone but light on specifics. That consistency, repeated over time, becomes its own signal. You begin to see how rarely timelines are addressed directly, how often questions are acknowledged but never resolved, how clarity is deferred in favor of general statements about growth, distance, or moving on. Those words sound reasonable in isolation, but when you hear them echoed across different situations, years apart, they start to feel rehearsed. The documentary doesn't need to say this. It lets the repetition speak, and repetition does something powerful to memory. It collapses excuses. It removes the benefit of doubt that comes from spacing. When moments are no longer isolated, when they're stacked instead of scattered, patterns become unavoidable. And once a pattern is visible, silence stops looking like restraint and starts looking like positioning. This is where the story becomes less about individuals and more about systems. Systems that understand how attention cycles work. Systems that rely on fatigue, on the assumption that people will eventually move on before coherence is required. For a long time, that assumption held. Because outrage burns fast, curiosity doesn't. What's changed now is the audience's role. Viewers aren't chasing shock anymore. They're comparing. They're revisiting. They're noticing how answers shift depending on who's asking, when they're asked, and what else is happening at the time. They're watching how narratives bend without breaking, and bending without breaking is a skill. The documentary highlights how engagement is controlled not by dominance, but by absence. If you don't engage, you don't create new material. If you don't create new material, old material stays unresolved instead of being contradicted. That unresolved space becomes a buffer, a place where narratives can exist without ever being closed. But buffers only work when people stop looking. This chapter shows what happens when people don't stop looking, when they revisit the same moments with fresh context, when they compare statements made under different pressures, when they notice how often responsibility is acknowledged in principle, but avoided in practice. There's no moment where someone is caught lying. That's not the point. The discomfort comes from realizing how often the truth was never fully invited into the conversation, how frequently complexity was used as a reason to stop digging rather than a reason to dig deeper. And that's where the weight comes from, because complexity doesn't excuse avoidance. It explains why avoidance can hide so effectively. As this section unfolds, the documentary slows even further. It widens its lens and asks a quieter question. Not what happened, but why certain moments were allowed to pass without resolution. Why some stories were deemed too complicated to revisit. Why explanations were always postponed to a future that never arrived. The unsettling realization is how familiar this strategy feels. A controversy emerges. A brief response is issued. Then time takes over. Time becomes the cleanup crew. It dulls edges. It softens memory. It creates enough distance for unresolved questions to feel old rather than unanswered. But when time is compressed, when decades of moments are placed back to back, that comfort disappears. Gaps become visible. Pauses feel intentional. Silence gains weight. This documentary quietly reframes silence not as maturity or wisdom, but as insulation. Insulation from accountability, from alignment, from having to reconcile stories that were allowed to live separately for too long. And insulation works until it doesn't. Because once viewers stop reacting emotionally and start watching structurally, the whole calculus changes. They aren't asking who to believe anymore. They're asking why certain conversations never progressed, why engagement always stopped at the same point, and why clarity was consistently postponed. That's when silence becomes data. Every pause gets logged. Every non-response gets noted. Every choice not to speak adds pressure instead of releasing it. Pressure doesn't need noise to function, it only needs consistency. And this chapter understands that. It doesn't rush or escalate. It lets the audience sit with one realization. For years, many moments were treated as separate incidents when they were actually part of a continuous pattern. Once that lands, everything shifts. Old interviews don't land the same anymore. Past confidence now feels rehearsed. Distance feels deliberate. Not because something new was proven, but because coherence has replaced coincidence. The story stops feeling accidental. And that's the most dangerous point for any long-running narrative, not when accusations get louder, but when alignment becomes visible. When viewers stop reacting emotionally and start evaluating structurally, when tone, timing, and avoidance matter more than words. This is also where reactions matter more than revelations. Once patterns are seen, every future move is interpreted through them. Silence doesn't reset the story anymore, it adds to it. The documentary understands this instinctively. It doesn't announce the shift. It trusts the viewer to feel it, to recognize that the room now knows it's being watched. And when a room knows it's being watched, behavior changes. Not dramatically, but subtly. Engagement becomes cautious. Language softens. Specifics grow rare. Not because there's nothing to say, but because saying anything creates a reference point. And reference points are dangerous when the past is being reassembled instead of forgotten. By the end of this stretch, the audience isn't waiting for a twist. They're watching movement: who speaks, who doesn't, who leans in, who pulls away. Choices that once felt invisible now feel loud. That's the shift. From here on, the story doesn't need new material to move forward. It feeds on absence, on the growing weight of what still hasn't been addressed, on the realization that silence, repeated often enough, stops feeling like restraint and starts feeling like strategy. At this stage, the documentary no longer needs to introduce ideas. It lets the weight of what already exists settle into place. And once that happens, silence can't behave the way it used to. This is the phase where time stops being a shield. For decades, time was the safest defense. Wait long enough and urgency fades. Details blur. Attention moves on. Questions that once felt sharp get labeled old news, not because they were answered, but because they became inconvenient to keep asking. That defense depended on fragmentation. As long as moments stayed separated by years, by headlines, by shifting cultural focus, they couldn't fully connect. Each incident lived on its own island. But now the islands are gone. The timeline has collapsed. Events once scattered across decades sit side by side. And when that happens, silence loses its camouflage. The story becomes irreversible not because a hidden tape suddenly appears or a new accusation drops, but because the audience can now see continuity where they were once encouraged to see coincidence. Continuity changes everything. A pause is no longer just a pause. A vague answer is no longer careful wording. A refusal to engage is no longer privacy. It becomes part of a visible pattern that repeats under the same kinds of pressure, in the same kinds of moments. And patterns don't accuse, they outlast. That's why this section doesn't chase emotional fireworks. There's no crescendo, no dramatic signal that the story's ending. Instead, it slows down, almost daring the viewer to sit with discomfort rather than escape it. And sustained discomfort forces evaluation. The audience isn't waiting to be told what to think they're measuring, how narratives adjust when pressure increases, how quickly specificity disappears when clarity would be costly, how often distance is chosen over engagement. This is where silence stops being interpreted as strength. It begins to feel like avoidance, not necessarily of guilt, but of alignment. Alignment would require reconciling stories that were allowed to remain separate. It would require answering questions that no longer exist in isolation, and that's the risk silence was always designed to avoid. The documentary never has to say this outright. It simply keeps placing moments next to each other, older interviews beside newer ones, early confidence beside later restraint, public statements beside private movement until the structure becomes visible. And structure is dangerous because structure implies intent. It suggests responses weren't improvised, but learned. Strategies that worked were reused, not maliciously, practically. Let attention rise. Let it peak, then stop feeding it. For years, that rhythm worked. But this chapter shows it only works when memory fades. And memory isn't fading anymore. Viewers are revisiting, replaying, comparing. The audience has shifted from reacting emotionally to observing structurally, and structural observation doesn't burn out like outrage. It lingers. That's why this part feels heavier than everything before it. Not louder, not angrier, heavier. Because weight doesn't dissipate, it accumulates. You start noticing how quickly conversations change when certain topics surface, how explanations stop just before becoming specific, how responses lean on broad language growth, distance, complexity instead of resolution. None of it is false, but none of it closes the loop either. And open loops don't disappear, they tighten. At the same time, the power dynamic quietly flips. For most of the story, power belonged to those who controlled engagement, who decided when to speak and when to withdraw. Now, power begins shifting to the audience, not because they're louder, but because they're steadier. They're no longer asking explosive questions, they're asking consistent ones. Why did this conversation end here? Why was this moment never revisited? Why does this explanation sound familiar? Those questions don't demand immediate answers. Their strength is persistence. And persistence is what silence was never designed to handle long term. By the end, the story doesn't feel like it's unfolding. It feels like it's settling, like sediment, finally reaching the bottom of water that's been stirred for years. Once it settles, clarity appears, not because something new is added, but because movement stops. This is when silence becomes loud, not through absence, but through repetition. Once you see it, you can't unsee it. Every future pause will be read through that lens. That's the real consequence of this chapter. It doesn't force a conclusion. It removes the ability to avoid one. From here on, every response or lack of response adds to the record. Silence no longer ends conversations. It extends them. And that's why this doesn't feel like an ending. It feels like a threshold. What comes next won't depend on new footage or new interviews. It will depend on reactions: who speaks, who doesn't, who engages, and who stays distant. That's the quiet shift this chapter creates. Not exposure, not accusation. Pressure built from continuity, memory, and the collapse of the gaps where forgetting once lived.